Hello. This is Discussing New Approaches, Thought Leadership series, where we delve into everything strategy, data, technology, and everything else in between. Today, I'm joined by Bertil Hatt, who's had 25 years in data science, working for companies like Facebook, Farfetch, and was actually the second data scientist at Deliveroo. So very well versed in applying and approaching data science methodologies and putting them into practice, as well as sort of building teams in those various companies, both in large companies and also sort of smaller SMEs and startups. I think I'll start us off, Bertil, by asking you a question directly. So why do you think LLMs and data are combining?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I probably, until a year ago, maybe, was one of the least convinced by that potential.
Mhm.
And then a tsunami of options came. It wasn't just OpenAI or Google or Microsoft. It was them, and like all of them have like 5 or 6 products. Plus, a couple of friends started a company called Infer. There's Patterns Analytics, Julius AI. All of those companies have been able to make some very convincing demonstration, not just of you type in, I want to have the conversion rate of this, and then it generates a semi-plausible SQL, something that would make sense given what Looker has been doing for a while. So like the ability to do some minute data work, but they came in with super impressive, insightful, deliberate response. And that was very striking for me. But after thinking about it a bit more, I realized this was the evolution of a multi-decade trend of how data work has been changing. And the fact that we've been able to automate up until the interpretation of the data is less of a surprise, and I think a very big trend in the industry, something that we now see as possible. Not everybody uses it every day. There's always this quote, the future's already here, just not evenly distributed. I think that's a very striking case of the future's already here. Like future data work is already done and possible. Not everybody does it. It's not evenly distributed in that way. And that is a big trend that I think will influence data work more than anything else I've seen in the last 20, 25 years of data work.
Amazing. I mean, I definitely agree with you. I think it's in interesting times, I think is the best way of describing it. I mean, we've talked a lot about formalism in our conversations previously. It's something I hadn't heard of previous to our conversations, to be honest. So how would you define that, and how is it related to the topic that we're talking about?
Yep. The first thing that you do when you study statistics or data is like you have like big tables and you're supposed to understand what makes sense. And the first ideas are reasonably simple: compute totals, make a ratio to compute an average, and then you have, because it's web related task, you have like, here's a funnel, and you have to understand what is the concept of a funnel and how you can actually be a bit more efficient in the way you compute things. And that is the first exposure you have to what I call a data pattern. And as I was working for different companies, I said, oh, they have the same questions as the company before. Or like, I have to do something for this team and this other team is like, has similar problem. For instance, I was working for a video game studio and like they launched a new game and I was like, oh, I just can retake the code I've written for the first game and like readapt it. So there's a structure here that is shared and makes sense. And then with another company, and like the data schema was a bit different, but the principle were the same. So the beginning of the query is different, but the end of it was similar. That made me think there is something there. And gradually I accumulated like more and more ideas and patterns, but it felt like an idea I was the only one to have. It wasn't really lonely because I was able to talk to, like, I recruited and grew a team. So there was members of my team that were like fresh faced out of university and like, here's a funnel. I'm like, what is a funnel? And what is, like, because they thought the kitchen thing. And I'm like, no, it's an abstraction. And like, oh, that's such an amazing idea. And then they realized it's actually a lot harder to implement that properly because there's exceptions and spam and things like that. So, but this was something that I felt was a thing without really having the opportunity to talk to people about it, because it wasn't something that was super common. Being a data scientist 15 years ago was still a bit of a rarity. I had the chance of joining Facebook in 2016, if my math is good. And then it was the big focus of the first weeks of what they called bootcamp, where being a data scientist was just being able to like use a computer the way that software engineer would, but rapidly was, here's all the data patterns that you have to know off the tip of your finger and you'll be able to reproduce. Like, you see this, it has to be a reflex. The big one was something called growth accounting, which is you have to define something that means a user is like hooked, how many, like they have enough friends, or like they're using the thing frequently enough, and then they're considered active. And then you say, okay, I've had so many users that were active in the last week, and that is the weekly active user, and that's a really important number. And some of them are going to be active the following week. Some of them are going to churn. We're going to have more new users that come between now and next week. And that allows you to have some actual accounting, which is like you had certain number of, you have more numbers and like double side accounting, like is a real framework that makes sense. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just funnels. That it was an overall approach to your work is to understand those patterns, refine them. If you see one, just reapply it. But you'll be a lot more effective if you can make applying those patterns something that is just as obvious as what you see in a computer software side. Computer software, for instance, they
Okay.
talk about, and if I talk to someone else who writes software for a living, I say, how do you apply unit tests? I don't have to explain to them what are unit tests, which type of unit test. If they've written enough, they know what I'm talking about. I don't have to explain to them what is version control. Like if I say, oh, do you use Git? They say, no, we use SVN. That doesn't mean like we use something completely different. They have like a slightly, they have the same principles behind it. And this ability to isolate, recognize, and adapt is something that was really instrumental. And that, so the formalism is less specific things and more the yearn to define those patterns and adapt, apply, refine them gradually. And that is something that I've seen gradually become a lot more obvious. One example of something that made a ton of sense, but I struggle to explain properly, was you have raw data and you try to make it accessible so that people who are not specialists can actually have the table that they think should exist. There's a lot of jokes about like, you ask me a question, you think that should take me 10 seconds to answer. It is true if I had this perfect table. And I was able to build, when I was at Deliveroo, like that perfect table with like my own way of thinking how that table should be done. But at the same time, consultants were working on DBT, database tools, a software tool that is now really popular, that is doing that systematically. And DBT for me is the one moment where all the data work that had some tools and some patterns were like, no, because we have that, how we work is a lot more systematic, a lot more testable, a lot more reliable, and we don't have all the nightmarish situation that we've had with it. That was the coalition of like what makes sense. It was also for me the end of a red beast, which is the data scientist. People came up with the name 15 years ago, and 10 years later, the people who came up with the name says this is going to go the way of the webmaster. By that, they mean it was a job that existed because people who were doing website did everything. Now there's no more webmasters, there's back-end, front-end, content writers, SEO specialists, marketers. Like that job has exploded into many specialties. Data scientist was a thing 15 years ago. And the last 5 years, it has exploded between machine learning researchers, machine learning engineers, analytics engineers, product analysts, because the tools have made that possible. And GPT was a very good example of a tool that created a role. And that role thinks about data completely differently than the analyst or data engineer, but work very closely with them, the same way that the front end and the back end engineer work together.
Of course,
This
yeah.
specialization is what I think has transformed the industry and made it so much more enjoyable to be a data scientist or a data person, because data scientists don't really exist anymore now that it was 15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that as well from a hiring perspective. It's the rise of the ML engineer and again tailoring it to specific business needs. Data scientist doesn't necessarily cover all of this. So is formalism and the way that you're describing this pattern recognition almost, is it similar to the scientific method of if you've got a theory and you're a scientist, because I think people always forget the scientist side of data science, and that is pattern recognition. It is testing a formula or testing a theory. If you want better a better churn rate, you've got to be able to test multiple different theories to see which one has a better outcome. So how would you equate it to that scientific theory, I suppose?
I think the scientific method
Mm.
is a coalition of a couple of patterns that all make a ton of sense. The two really obvious one are the double-blind experiment or the randomized control trial that has been the staple in tech. We call it an A/B test. There's a bit of variation and a couple of like refinements, but that is for me one of the really big patterns that makes sense, and it's obvious. There's this quote that is attributed to everybody, including Mark Zuckerberg, around "In God we trust, everybody else brings data." I don't know if he said it, but if he said it, he didn't mean bring me a dashboard, he said, bring me an A/B test result. And that's I think the end state of those patterns is they become so obvious that you don't even mention that it's a thing. And the second aspect of the scientific method is peer discussions. And that's, I think, one thing that is a bit overlooked. People who actually, scientists who work for professionally, like to dismiss reviewer number 2 as being someone who's got terrible manners and is very difficult to please. That, I think, is overlooking what could be a really good scientific debate, and why so many scientists now are on social media, like talking about their job with their peers, because it's a much more enjoyable way of like making sense of what you're trying to do. And the pattern here is you don't attack the person, you attack the methodology. Is it the making assumptions? Are those assumptions true that allow you to criticize someone's work without challenging what they're doing, but changing the direction they're going? And for me, that those two things, control for things with a randomized control trial and challenge the assumptions in open conversation that is not without attack, those two things make the scientific method and absolutely make what I think is the most exciting part of being a data scientist. I'm more than happy to show what are the SQL patterns that allow you to go from a bunch of events to sessionized data to like a proper growth accounting table, and then say, here's what we could do to improve the quality of the website. But I think that last step, because we are a website that people look up as an expert website, we should drive more content. How do we test that? What are the experimental design that would make sense? That for me is the end state of a data scientist, both in terms of experience, but also in terms of having the tools to have the first steps, all the data processing, vanish as something that is obvious, integrated into the tools we use every day, something that you don't have to like belabor as much as you had to 15 years ago. And that's, I think, the benefit of having this structure, this systematic approach to processing data, is you can focus on the interesting questions, which is, who are we as a service? What is the actual added value that we bring? How do we need to change to be even better at what we do?
Yeah, and I think value is the key word there. I think people, again, you, even with things like ML and AI, in order to improve it within the business, in order to prove that there's a genuine use case, you have to tie it to value. There's no other way around that. But I suppose, bringing it back to LLMs, how do you think LLMs will change businesses or change business?
I think the LLMs have really benefited from this formalism, because they've been able to see, we have looked at 10,000 SQL queries that all seem to be relevant. And all the SQL queries that use the word funnel in the description have the same kind of structure. All the SQL queries that look at A/B tests seem to have the same column names. All the SQL queries and that has allowed people training those models to actually have models that are a lot more effective, because they're not trying to go from, here's a raw log data, including spam and like super unhelpful information on millions of lines. Here's a magical query, and then you have really good insights. It has broken down into, here's the different steps that make sense. Because you have from towards data science, or like a lot of other open source Kaggle content that explains the different steps, they've been able to say, I know what is the structure of a good data analysis, so I can reproduce the agenda, the different steps. And I know what each step should contain, because I've seen a lot of examples of the same keywords. And so I can just, given a certain context, give a very helpful thing, because I know the patterns are a lot more regular, a lot more systematic, a lot more routine. And so an LLM has been able to exploit that a lot better than it would for artistry or like the other things where LLM is still struggling to help. Because data work has been so systematic and well structured, it is a lot easier for LLMs to imitate. And that's where I think they are so transformational in the industry, or they could be so transformational. They haven't been yet. It's a bit of a mystery for me why, but they are incredibly convincing.
No, definitely. And what do you think that roadblock is? What do you think is stopping them from being that transformational?
Habits is probably the. I have this image in my head that I cannot get out of. Will E. Coyote, the Warner Bros. The thing, that keeps running around, and he somehow always jumps over a cliff, looks down, and has been suspended in the air for 3 seconds, and only falls when he realizes that he's off the cliff. And I feel like we are in those 3 seconds where Will Hike, because he hasn't really looked down, like, people leading data teams having been like, why if I replace my entire team with LLMs? Like, this is not a way of presenting the question they have. The reason I think that is not because I think of that particular use case, it's because I've got my hair in my hair, so I can talk about how the world was before the internet. But I remember a time where every document had to be on paper because that made sense. Like, there wasn't an alternative. And then email came around, and people essentially used email as the equivalent of an envelope to send documents around. Even if you could have exactly the same information on a web form the way you have now with mobile apps. It was possible, but people didn't do it because there was a very strong tendency, I don't know what better to say, to use the same kind of patterns. For very long, people like used email to send what was essentially PDFs or Word document that copied the sheet of paper format, because that was what people, if you had to exchange information, that information had to be on the sheets of paper of a certain size, and that's just what they copied. And moving from that to, I'm sending you a link to a web form and you can fill that web form, took a lot longer than it should have. And that wasn't just that. It was a lot of companies had really large team that historically had been responsible for maintaining that, and transforming those teams to something completely different was something that was incredibly difficult. I remember working for the telecommunication incumbents in France, and it was really obvious, like, so many teams at that company were large because they needed to deal with physical problems, and all those could be replaced by digital process that needed far fewer people. And managers were like, what do we do with this entire armies of people? Like, this was incredibly difficult this transition was very difficult to imagine for that specific context. A much more modern example of the same, we have a way of working and it makes sense even if it's obviously obsolete, is a recent process. My partner is a scientist, and so she does what all scientists do, which is she's not looking for insights or research, she's looking for money. And so all her energy is into writing grants application, which is 30, 40 page long document explaining all her research, all the science around it, the possibilities she could do, and what science she would be able to do if she had a little bit more extra money. Those are incredibly like detailed documents, and they're being sent to National Science Foundation, like those kind of institutions that can grant them money. And they are read by other specialists who do what I can only imagine is an incredibly tedious and difficult and intellectual job of like looking at those really long 40-page long applications, processing them, understanding them, making sense of them. My dad, that was his job at the end of his career. He was doing a lot of that. And I was always impressed by the, like, it was like really thick stacks of paper, and every single page was like filled of equations and details and insights, references that you were supposed to know off the top of your head. It was incredibly difficult work. And it made sense to do that 2 years ago. And that's what my partner did. And she just, because you keep recycling and like updating those applications, she uses one. And I said, just try if ChatGPT has any opinion about it. Not very convinced. She did try, and she was like, wow, that tool is actually able to understand, or seems like it understands the science, and it has made some really insightful suggestions. It hasn't been able to like suggest references because it's not really optimized for that. But the clarity, the tone, the way to present the different thing, just the fact that like that scientific keyword is connected to this other scientific keyword, and so it makes sense to break it down. I think that she was really impressed by.
So it's almost like pattern recognition in the LLM's capability to, and I think we see the same thing in law as well. What will happen to the law industry is going to be very interesting moving forward, and they could be not out of a job, but their capability and the amount of money
that
that can be made
operation is reproduced by the person who's reading that grant on the other side. And I am convinced, because there's no physical way that they would do otherwise, that the people receiving this 40-page document from not her, but like 100 other people, sees all these documents and like, can I just get a summary of those? What is the problem with that? What is the question I need to ask? What is the, how do I like, because it's such a tedious and extensive work. And so essentially what we have now is two people who use the format of a 40-page long document, and she transcribes to the abstraction that ChatGPT uses, the vector base, uses insight like this, and then turns it back into a 40-page long document, sends it. The person turns back into a vector impression, gets some questions about it. And so there is this skeuomorphic thing where like they'll pretend to use the 40-page document because that's the format they've always been using their entire life. But it's not really what they're exchanging. What they're exchanging is something that you could represent as an abstraction. And for instance, it would make sense for her to send a document that is not a 40-page long document, but a digital abstraction of her research, what she could be doing, what she wants to do. That is essentially her copy-pasting her entire work without having to edit like a demand. And the person on the side could be like, ask questions the way that you can ask questions to ChatGPT. It's de facto what they're doing now, but they're kind of playing around it. The same way that 20 years ago, people were sending each other PDFs that you had to print and write down and scan and send back by email because they were using email to pretend that we're playing with paper.
Yeah.
And that's the next step for that for me is the kind of reports that I do. I make presentation, 15-page long presentation, justifying a product change or a new experiment, or like understanding a new customer breakdown. Those are because my job is to stand in front of people and on the big screen showing them insights and then answer the question that they might have. But it was really a modern way to do things 2 years ago. I feel now it's obsolete. And I feel like what they really want to have is a conversation with either me if I'm available, or a lot more available and not more insightful ChatGPT that understands the work I've been doing or does the work instead of me and is able to answer anyone's specific questions.
That's interesting. I suppose with that in mind, so with these changes and I suppose almost the demand that you're recognizing within what people want to use this for, what do you think the next decade will look like for LLMs?
I think they will be used anecdotally, or like to do this transformation quite a lot. I expect a lot of people to like write a 15-page long presentation for why we should implement this new feature, give it to ChatGPT and say, is there any problem with it? And ChatGPT do spell checks, improve and say, actually, this is a pie chart and you have a problem, but use teal. And actually, if it's a problem, you should be able to use orange or red because it's scarier, like marginal changes. But I expect that while you have that, people are going to be like, oh, here's a presentation I'm going to talk in front of you, but I also created like the GPTs, the little applets that has all the context of the document, and you can ask questions to that applet while I'm making the presentation, or before, after, or like when I'm not available, to answer all your questions. And that will be a substitute for a standard presentation or like reading a 15-page document. That will gradually appear because people still want to talk to a human, and those tools are not perfect. So sometimes the tool say something that doesn't make sense. So what's really common now with ChatGPT is just really generic response. Like it doesn't really answer a question. It gives a structure that like makes sense. But I think gradually those things are going to be a lot more insightful. Another aspect that I think is going to be really systematic is I'm supposed to like do a bit of analysis. I know what I'm supposed to do, but just typing out like I'm supposed to clean the data, I'm supposed to process the data and I aggregate and then like find some insights and then draw some charts and then something makes sense. Rather than do all that immediately, I'm going to say ChatGPT, like, here's the database I'm supposed to analyze, what you to do. And it would just do a week of work in like 2 minutes. And I look at it and I modify it marginally. But all that multiple hours of writing SQL queries, writing matplotlib equation to get like graphics, all that is going to be automated because what I'm doing is not that creative in that regard. So there's two things I think are going to be in parallel. Just like you're going to have people, sending forms by email and filling and printing and sending the scan back by email. Like there's going to be pretending around a skeuomorphic version of what the world was years before for a bit longer. But I think a lot of people are going, like, especially new companies that have to decide, should we hire more analysts? They'll be like, we have one analyst for 5 teams and they seem to be doing really great because rather than do a week of work, they ask ChatGPT, review the thing and like send reports, and they don't spend as much time doing presentations because the presentations are optimized or because people ask questions to ChatGPT, not to the analyst. So it'd be like, we don't need to hire that many analysts. So I expect teams are going to grow with few analysts as it is. But one thing I expect in the next 10 years is that the analyst, rather than answer individual product owners' questions, is going to do the balance between data engineering, analytics engineering, product analyst, building machine learning is going to rebalance dramatically. One example of a job that is really impressive, really keen, and that people do a lot is machine learning research. More people are going to do it, but the impact that they're going to have is going to increase because it's a lot easier for people to find the right kind of paper, the right kind of implementation in code, and apply them to their specific situation. So all this, what came out of Kaggle is going to explode. One like version of that that already has started. I remember 15 years ago I was at a conference with the team that now has Data IQ, which is a very smart way of hosting your ML models. And they were presenting like what came out of people that were doing Kaggle as competitive, like professionally, like people that were top. And it was always super impressive, like very smart machine learning models that were able to like optimize all the features, find all the possible combination, do a hyperparameter optimization automatically. At the end of the presentation, I was asking like, does this mean I'm out of a job? It became a joke between me and the organizers. And literally for 2 years, the only thing I did was stand up at the end of the presentation, am I out of a job? And every time people like, kind of, until we all realized that we're doing one tiny part and like processing the data. We've seen a lot of those graphics of like people who've spent a lot of time in Kaggle are really good at one ML part, which is very difficult, very interesting middle part of a lot of work around making sure data has the right format. dbt handles a big chunk of that, making sure data is okay. And I think there's going to be more people doing machine learning because they can have that part more easily accessible to everybody, because those libraries, those tools are going to be easier to find, easier to reuse, easier to optimize for, the way that scikit-learn has made scientific research on statistics available for everybody. I expect that people are going to spend a bit more time making sure that the data they have is in the right structure. Right now, you have a ton of company where the data is kind of between Excel spreadsheets, couple of tables, it's not super well organized. That is going to be really costly because you cannot use that to tell ChatGPT to work on your data. So everybody's going to use whatever's the next step to GPT. A lot of companies are going to have like data that is well documented, well structured, with proper versioning, with good insights, because that's going to make sense. One thing I'm hoping to get is you have a website, you change your website, and you don't tell the data team because who cares? And the data team to catch up because they realize that the data is different than it was a week ago, and they have to like, wait, was there a feature change we're not told about? That kind of catch up, I think, is going to be estimated, for instance, which means that the data is more up to date and cleaner and more sensible and easier to plug into ChatGPT. Because ChatGPT is good if you ask them a question, but you say, here's my data schema, can you answer? Then it's a lot better. And I think that's what I really hope is people who with data in the job title are going to spend a bit more time not doing the nitty-gritty work, but talking about data strategy. It's going to be a lot more obvious for a company that you can have access to all the machine learning tools you have. If you don't have customer activity that tells you what they want, what they like, what they're willing to pay for, there's nothing much you can do with those tools.
Yeah.
And so concepts like data gravity, personalization, like if you have a lot of data, you can do things more effectively. Things that have been the basic of like Facebook, Google, booking, like strategy, or like if we know our customers, we can serve them better. That is going to be a lot more purposive and something that data professionals can explain and be like, if we could ask what is their preference, we can make better recommendation. That kind of mindset is going to be hopefully a bit more present at the senior level.
Yeah. So it's like all AI, it's all going to be focused on, process optimization. It's optimizing in general, I suppose. All of these functions it's taking out, like you said, the grunt work, focusing so humans can add the human insight and not be as tied down to the grunt data work, which is very repetitive and it is going to sort of replace a lot of those functions. I suppose it's another question whether companies are ready for those LLMs to be introduced, and obviously, like you said, transitioning more towards sort of engineering and those areas means that feeding these models and feeding these things to keep them running efficiently is going to be obviously very important, because again, an LLM is only as good as the data it's being fed and how many hallucinations it might spit out on the other end. But again, it's been really, really interesting. And again, hopefully we can maybe save us a couple of those questions for a revisit a little bit later down the line. But it's been really, really fascinating conversation. I think I've learned a lot, to be honest, about LLMs, increasing my knowledge base, which is great. So hopefully everyone watching can take away a few takeaways from these as well. But thank you, Bertil. Thank you for your time today, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and hopefully we can do this again very soon.
Hopefully so. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.